In this Steelrising video, we're going to be taking a look at the new DLC that just released today called Cagliostro's Secrets, and go over whether it's worth your time and money or not. However, before we get into the DLC, I do want to mention that there have been some updates to the game since it originally launched on September 8th. Namely, New Game Plus has been added to the game, which adds new weapons and armor, as well as enemy types, which gives people another reason to play the game on a harder difficulty. There also have been balancing tweaks, like the increase of boss damage, improving their resistances, etc., and lowering the damage and quality of grenades is a thing now as well. Those were being abused in the base game, so it's glad to see that those have been patched and adjusted accordingly. The general premise of Cagliostro's Secrets is that you'll be basically doing a side area from the main game, that you're required to be about 80% of the game or way through the game before you're able to unlock. So you need to be a bit through the main story. You don't need to have done the side quest to do this, but you need to be particularly placed in the main storyline, have completed the Bastille mission in order to access this area. And there's going to be new enemies here, new bosses, new characters to find, and it's kind of like a side jaunt from the main storyline. When it comes to the story and setting of this particular part of the game, this little expansion, it's not like particularly narrative heavy the way the main game is, and there isn't like any unpredictable twists or anything like that. A lot of the stuff that you learn is anecdotal and kind of gives you context to how the events of the main game came about. So don't expect it to be like a very heavy story-driven experience in that regard. Generally speaking, you're going to see similar environments to what you've seen before. You still can't enter buildings. You see there are going to be more automats roaming around than you would typically see. And the visual and facial expressions of characters is about the same. That is to say, not very good. So basically, in this regard, you're kind of getting the same that you got in the main game, just like in a little bit of a side area. You will be getting new equipment in this area, namely the Lightning Chain, Gaia Claws, Wheel of Justice, Rail Baton and Shear, and Extendable Batons. Some of these are direct upgrades over what you've probably been using in the main game, and some of these are downgrades. So it's kind of a mixed bag here. Not everything is better, and it probably depends on what class you're playing and what style of playing that you are using for this game. It's going to depend on like whether this actually benefits you or whether you need this DLC to be more powerful than you were previously. There is also a new armor set to get, but it is not one of the best in the game, and it's a bit of a downgrade compared to some of the endgame armor you can get in the base game, so that shouldn't be a factor in your decision as well. When it comes to the combat and combat encounters in the Steelrising DLC, it's basically the same. I mean, you're going to spend time managing your stamina to avoid frost status effects, moving around, dodging attacks, and damaging hostile automats. Rather than a fully fledged expansion, it sort of feels more like a mini extension of the game, of like what's already there. You'll notice the balancing changes if you haven't played the game in a while, but for the most part, it's going to feel just like the base game felt. As I mentioned earlier, the enemy variety is pretty good in this little expansion, and there are new enemies. There are mixed in with old enemies, but there are a lot of new ones as well, which is great. These are Mesmer-inspired, as the developers have said. There's like a Necromancer that will revive itself and fallen comrades, which you have to deal with. There's an Apothecary who excels in dealing frost damage. There's a Gravedigger who does multiple heinous experiments on subjects, and there are just other enemy types that will make you learn their moves and like really have to learn and adapt to them like the way you did in the base game before you kind of got it all down. So it's not just old enemies in a new area with new loot. There are new enemies as well, and I think players are going to find these particularly interesting as it kind of freshens up the game a bit. Honestly, the new enemies are really, really good, and it makes me wish that some of the base game enemies were better or that they'd sort of gotten a revamp, because probably my biggest complaint about Steelrising in general was the lack of enemy variety and the difficulty of the enemies. Although regular enemies were much harder than bosses in the base game, I do wish there was more variety, and it felt like there were maybe only like a handful of enemy types throughout the game, or maybe like, you know, between 5 to 10 enemies, and once you learned them, it was just a matter of going through them. So I'm glad to see they have new enemies, and these are really intriguing, but I wish maybe that they would add more to the base game at some point, or like kind of revamp them and add more moves to them. On the technical side of things, I had much fewer performance issues in this build than in the base game, and I have not encountered any visual glitches from before. The DLC is
$14.99
USD, and given that the 3 hours of gameplay at most is what you're going to get out of it, depending on how meticulously you explore the area, it's a pretty steep price for 3 hours. I feel like people deserve better than that, particularly since this could have been part of the original game for all we know. In my opinion, either you should wait for a sale and try and get this as a bundle with the base game at some point if you haven't played it yet, or just wait for it to be on sale in general and pick it up for around $5 or so. So just kind of to recap, the new DLC basically provides you with a new area, new enemies, new bosses, and new loot. It doesn't really change any of the formula of the game. It gives you about 3 hours of gameplay. And I feel like it's going to appeal to fans of the game already, but it's not likely to bring in new players. If you liked Steelrising for what it was, then you'll like the DLC. Whether it's worth it or not, I'm not entirely sure. But if you really, really like Steelrising, I guess you could justify that. Otherwise, I would suggest waiting for a sale. What are your guys' thoughts? Have you guys played Steelrising yet? Is it a game that you guys enjoyed? What do you guys think about the DLC from what you've learned so far? Let us know in the comments below.